And then I just want to say thanks again, everyone, for coming on today. We will make sure we send an email out with a link to the recording so that, if you want to amplify it on social media or, pull screenshots for yourself or whatever, you are able to do that. And, again, just really grateful to everyone for their responsiveness in terms of being able to come today and preparing such, great comments. Let's hope it leads to reforms.
You're muted. You're muted, right?
Just letting everyone know we will automatically broadcast so that attendees can start joining right at 1.
Great. Excellent. Thank you everyone for coming today. We will get started shortly with the webinar. Thank you everyone for coming. We're glad you're here. We will get started shortly. If you're just joining us, welcome to the webinar. My name is Johanna Newman. I'm the Senior Director of Environment America's campaign for 100% renewable energy, and we will get started shortly. If you're just joining us, welcome. My name is Johanna Newman. I'll be our MC today, and we will get started shortly. If you're just joining us, welcome. My name is Johanna Newman. I'm Environment America's Senior Director for our campaign for 100% renewable energy. Welcome to the webinar. We'll get started shortly. All right. It is 1:01 p.m. and I'm a big believer in keeping the trains running mostly on time. So we're going to go ahead and get started. I want to, first of all, thank you so much for joining us today for Environment America's webinar entitled Learning from Texas, Preventing the Next Blackout by Building a Resilient Energy System. We're glad you can join us. My name is Johanna Newman, and I'm the Senior Director of the Campaign for 100% Renewable Energy at Environment America. In that role, I direct our Federation's efforts to adopt clean, green, renewable energy as quickly as possible through our work at the local, state, and federal level. Environment America itself is a national federation of 29 state-based groups that works to protect our air, water, and open spaces through timely and targeted action that makes a difference. And in that spirit, we bring you today's webinar that aims to unpack what caused the outages in Texas earlier this month and explain what can be done to prevent situations like this in the future. One key factor that led to millions of Texas huddling in the cold without power for days earlier this month is Texas's heavy reliance on gas plants and other centralized power sources. Texas relies on gas to heat 35% of its homes and to generate more than 50% of its electricity. But when the cold hit, Texas's gas-reliant energy system failed. Regulators had planned to have about 67 gigawatts of electric capacity online during the winter that came from centralized thermal power plants, namely gas, coal, and nuclear plants. And in the hardest times during the cold snap, somewhere between 28 gigawatts and 30 gigawatts, so more than 40% of the expected generation was offline due to weather. And the images on this slide show some of that frozen gas infrastructure. Today's webinar will feature 6 experts who will touch on what went wrong in Texas earlier this month, and also explain the solutions that we have right now that could prevent scenarios like this from repeating themselves in Texas or beyond. And after our expert panel, we will have time for questions and answers that you can put in the chat box throughout the course of the conversation. Our first panelist is Luke Metzger. Luke is the Director of Environment Texas, where he is a leading voice in our state for clean air, clean water, clean energy, and open space. Over his 20-year tenure leading Environment Texas, Luke has led successful campaigns to protect the Christmas Mountains of Big Bend, to compel Exxon, Shell, and Chevron Phillips to cut air pollution at refineries and chemical plants in the state, and to boost funding for water conservation and state parks. The San Antonio Current has called Luke, quote, long one of the most energetic and dedicated defenders of environmental issues in the state. Thanks, Luke. You're up.
Great, thanks, Johanna. So my family lost power and heat in Austin for about 3 days. So my 2 young daughters pictured here, my wife and I put on multiple layers of clothes, slept together under a pile of blankets in the living room, and were pretty miserable as it got as low as 5 degrees outside. Later, we had to boil water for several days. But we made it through okay, and unfortunately, many others were not so fortunate. An 11-year-old boy died in his bed of hypothermia. A woman lost her 3 beautiful children to a house fire. Another woman died due to carbon monoxide poisoning from trying to stay warm. And in addition to the incredible loss of human life, there was also an enormous economic toll. Texans suffered from busted water pipes and other weather-related problems, which together might add up to be billions of dollars of damage, and it might become the state's most expensive natural disaster in our history. Next slide. And this didn't have to happen. Our energy system failed millions of Texans when we needed it most. And with climate change bringing more extreme weather, that's only likely to get worse unless we fix 3 key vulnerabilities in our current fragile system. First, we need to, we are dependent on relatively few big centralized power plants to produce most of our energy, and we rely on transmission lines to carry it long distances to our homes. Problems with just a few of those power plants or transmission lines can quickly affect millions. Second, extreme weather events are becoming more frequent. The infrastructure we built 30 or 50 years ago isn't equipped to handle more common or severe deep freezes or wildfires or wetter, more powerful hurricanes. And then finally, our energy system's dependence on fossil fuels is adding more climate change causing pollution to our air, which will cause even more extreme weather in our future. And as the events in Texas showed, fossil fuels can be unreliable when we need them most. And so, next slide. What happened in Texas really should be a wake-up call, certainly to our state's leaders, as well as the nation, and it must spur elected officials, regulators, and utility companies to build a better and more resilient system. And let's see. And so today's speakers are going to touch on the core points of what a more resilient system might look like: local generation, a more efficient system, and better interconnection locally and nationally. Next slide. So one small example from my own experience during the blackout, we ran an extension cord from my electric car to the house and were able to keep our phones powered. But just think if every Texan had an electric car in their driveway, which could be used not just to power phones, but also the furnace and the refrigerator during emergencies. I have solar panels in my home, but if I also had a battery, I could have had even more electricity. We have so many solutions available to us. We just need to put them to work. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Luke. Our next speaker is Virginia Palacios. Virginia is a 9th generation Tejana from Webb County, Texas, who also happens to have more than 14 years of environmental science and policy experience. Virginia recently formed the organization Commission Shift to build public support to hold the Railroad Commission of Texas accountable to its mission. Virginia, go ahead.
Thank you, Johanna. And so just to add to that, but what most folks probably don't know is that the Railroad Commission is the agency in Texas that is responsible for oversight of the oil and gas industry. They don't have anything to do with railroads. And so I'm just going to talk a little bit about some of the areas where the gas supply chain failed, both this year and 10 years ago in 2011. And so I'm going to be referencing some of excerpts from a report that came out in 2011 from FERC and NERC that evaluated winter power outages in 2011 and 1989 and several years in between. So we've been here before. We haven't quite made the changes that we needed to make to avoid the disaster that we saw just a couple of weeks ago. And so this is, just kind of looking at some of those failures so that we can actually make the changes we need to make this time. Next slide. And I'll kind of breeze through some of these first slides since Johanna already talked about some of these. Next slide. So 99% of gas customers actually retained gas supply to their homes. So this was a lesson learned from 2011, where the local distribution companies did make the changes that they needed to make to ensure that gas supply to homes was maintained. So that was good. Next. Next. Okay, so what went wrong on the gas supply chain? Next slide. In summary, water is a big part of a lot of fossil fuel infrastructure, and when it freezes, equipment breaks down. Bad roads kept trucks from getting to facilities to fix certain aspects. There's a lack of real-time data exchange between agencies, generators, et cetera. And then there's a lot of interdependencies between the gas supply chain and electricity that cause failures on both ends. Next. So this is just a diagram of how the natural gas supply chain works. So over here on the left, you have the production wells. Those travel through gathering pipelines and usually through compressor stations, which are not pictured on this chart, which help to give the gas enough pressure to get to the processing plant and then out of the processing plant to different kinds of customers, whether it's gas-fired electric generation or the gas distribution company that takes gas to residences and businesses. Next slide. And so starting with production, one of the areas where we think one of the biggest problems could have been is right at the wellhead. So when natural gas is produced, it's produced along with naturally occurring water in the formation. And when that water comes through the equipment at the surface, it freezes at the wellhead, it freezes in flow lines, and cuts off gas supply. That water, normally is going into these water storage tanks. You see that blue cylinder towards the middle of the slide. And one of the big issues was that trucks have to actually go out to the sites and grab that water and take it away. And if they don't, those storage tanks fill up and an auto shutoff valve cuts off production from the well. So we were seeing both of these problems at the production sites. Next. Natural gas flow as a result declined precipitously. That green section of the chart you see is gas coming from the wellhead. And you can see over here on February 14th and 15th, it went down to practically nothing. Next. Storage did come into play. And so generators were able to withdraw from storage and use it. I think there were some other failures in the system that prevented the kind of pressure that they really needed to keep things going. And that's something where I think as we continue in these investigations, we're going to learn more about just how much gas was restricted from the production side versus, the storage side or the generation side. And so we're still kind of waiting for all the pieces to fall out. Next. These are some of the winterization techniques over at production wells. You can inject methanol into the wellhead, and that helps to prevent water from freezing. You can add heated housing. You can insulate flow lines. Next slide. But Texas is not like every other cold state. So I live down here in Webb County, which is down in the very southern part of Texas on the Mexican border. And yesterday it was 90 degrees outside. So if you winterize wells and you have heat going to the wells, once the temperatures rise again back up to 90, you wouldn't want to have all that equipment on there. At least that's what Railroad Commissioner Christy Craddock has said in her testimony last night and this morning. And so I think we need to be evaluating, what kind of winterization techniques are going to make the most sense. Next. So compressor stations, I think this is probably an area where there was a lot of failure. These compressor stations, as you can see in this diagram, occur both after the production sites and after the gas processing plants, and in other areas where you have to boost pressure to get the gas to go through the line. In some cases, pressure changes can cause more liquid to drop out. Again, you can run into that auto shutoff issue with water storage tanks. But for the most part, these compressors are running on electricity. So in this year and in 2011, a lot of these compressor stations weren't able to get electricity, and that caused failures across the whole supply chain. Next. Processing plants, weren't able to get supply because of wellhead freeze-offs in 2011. Christy Craddock said that electricity was the biggest issue, but I think we have to look carefully at that, because it could be that the Railroad Commission doesn't want to take responsibility for winterization of gas wells. So we just need to look carefully at all this data as it comes out. Next slide. And then of course there's the generation side. Gas supply curtailments weren't all that significant in 2011. They did cause some failures in 2003. Last night, Christy Craddock cited this chart saying that 6% of the problems in electricity were related to gas supply, but generators have said that gas supply was one of the biggest issues they were facing. So we have some conflicting reports here, and I think we need to, again, just keep pressing for the data, the information, and the investigations. Next slide. And then another issue is that, after you finally do get electricity to the sites, it takes 24 to 36 hours for that gas to begin to flow. So that's why it can take so long for us to get power back online, even after things start warming up. Next. And again, she's emphasizing these power outages a lot in her testimonies. I think we still have to look carefully at the wellhead winterization issue. Next. This was one of the best questions that was asked last night during the hearings. Why didn't somebody know? And the answer is we did know. We knew this from 2011, but we didn't make the changes that we needed to make to prevent this disaster from happening this year. Next. So just in summary, these are some of our missed opportunities, lessons that we've learned before that we didn't change. Requiring winterization of gas wells and compressor stations, real-time data for the transmission sector, electricity backup for production, compressors, processing plants, and then having the ability to clear roads for produced water trucks. And that's all.
Thank you so much, Virginia.
Oh, can I just say one last thing?
Please.
Commission Shift is a new organization. We're actually launching on Tuesday, March 2nd, and there's a link if y'all want to come to our event next week. Thanks.
Congratulations on forming it. Our next speaker is Maria McCoy. Maria is a research associate of the Energy Democracy Initiative at the Institute for Local Self-Reliance. Maria brings expertise in community solar and distributed solar adoption to today's webinar. Her research focuses on how communities can transition to clean, decentralized energy systems that are both equitable and economically viable. Go ahead, Maria.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm really excited to be part of this conversation, and I'll jump right in. So why localized energy production? I'm going to start with two main points. First, that producing and using power locally is better for the grid. So transmitting electricity from huge power plants really far away incurs a lot of losses, which is very expensive. Also, a reliance upon long distance transmission puts communities at risk of transmission failures. These transmission lines need regular maintenance, See the example of PG&E in California, but local generation can reduce the need for costly upgrades. There's also room on the grid to accommodate additional solar and distributed generation with little spending needed. My second main point here is that when done right, local clean energy provides local jobs, reduced electric bills for members of the community, and it displaces polluting power plants. Since peak solar production somewhat coincides with peak demand, especially in the summers, it can displace energy from peaker plants, which are some of the most expensive plants to buy power from, and they're also some of the most polluting, and they're disproportionately located in marginalized communities that are really suffering from health impacts of this pollution. So we need clean energy to curb global climate change, but local and clean energy production also has an impact on the community through increased resilience. Looking specifically at the example of Texas, snow does hamper solar generation, but it doesn't halt it entirely. Snow often slides away or melts away within just a few days. Solar panels also have increased efficiency when the weather is cold. Getting fuel supply is not an issue with solar, but it is an issue with gas plants or emergency generators. And as Virginia mentioned, Texas had some of these frozen gas lines and infrastructure, and gas plants were not able to keep up their supply of power. Solar is also insulated from the price swings in fuel supply, as we now see Texans with these astronomical bills after an upswing in gas prices, and these prices are affecting people all over the country. But solar is a lot more predictable. There are no fuel costs. I don't really have time to dive into the electrification of heating and cooling here, but I do want to say that it's possible in all climates. Either way, electricity is needed even to run a gas furnace and keep people warm, and that electricity could come from solar. So there are many benefits of local solar generation, but two problems really remain, and these are accessibility and storage, because solar without connection to battery storage goes down when the grid goes down. Next slide, please. This is why we need solar and storage for all. So our transition to clean energy cannot leave people behind. There are some who are going to be able to do solar plus storage, but electricity has become an essential service, and it cannot be a luxury for homeowners who have solar on their roof and storage or a Tesla to draw power from. And so one emerging solution to this is community solar with storage. A little background on community solar. It's allowed in 19 states. Texas is not one of those yet, but it brings many of the benefits to clean energy to those who have traditionally been left out. Combining storage with these community solar installations is still rare, but so was adding storage to residential rooftop solar not too long ago. One example I want to highlight here is East Bay Community Energy, a community choice aggregation in California. So this entity, it's more of an electricity broker than a utility, but it's creating resiliency centers with solar plus storage for its customers. It's also prioritizing and facilitating solar and storage capacity for customers who are identified as medical baseline or electricity dependent. So that all covers why localize energy production, which if you're attending this webinar, you might not need too much convincing, but what about how to do it? So I'd like to briefly introduce some policy options on how you can make this happen, very briefly, but listed on this slide are some state level policies that encourage local energy generation build out. So there's community solar, as I've already mentioned. You can also add a carve out for solar or distributed energy to a renewable portfolio standard. You could implement a solar or solar ready mandate for buildings in the state. There's also PACE financing. This is a local financing mechanism for energy efficiency and renewable energy, but it must be enabled at the state level. And this photo on the slide is from ILSR's Community Power Map, which maps out these policies and more that support local energy action. Next slide, please. On this slide, there are some options for cities and communities to facilitate new local energy generation. They could pass a solar ordinance to forward local priorities for solar installations. These could include ground cover or pollinator habitat, as we saw on my first slide. You can also use an ordinance to simplify solar permitting, especially making it cheaper. Communities could pass a local solar mandate, not much different from a state solar mandate. And then they could also collect a city or regional climate fund. This is an initiative that's becoming a lot more popular now and is in many major cities across the US. One example is the Portland Clean Energy Fund, which allocates 40 to 60% of this money to grants for clean energy projects. And within a program like this, I think would be especially important within our context here is that you could prioritize projects in communities that are likely to have their power shut off in rolling blackouts. And this photo here is from ILSR's Community Power Toolkit, which has stories and examples from cities taking charge of their energy future. Next slide. So that's all the time I have for now, but you can find more at ilsr.org, including the Community Power Map and Toolkit. And you can also contact me over email, maria@ilsr.org. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Maria. That was really informative. Our next speaker is Justin Brandt. Justin is the Utility Program Co-Director of the Southwest Energy Efficiency Project, also known as SWEEP. He regularly appears before public utility commissions and state legislatures, and he collaborates with utilities and other stakeholders to advance energy efficiency in SWEEP's 6-state region. Go ahead, Justin.
Great. Good morning, everyone, or at least this morning where I am. I guess next slide, please. And you can skip this. Johanna did a great job of introducing SWEEP. So this slide didn't come through very well, but essentially, so on Valentine's Day in Texas, they set a new winter peak demand record. So the demand for electricity was over 3,000 megawatts higher than it had ever been in the winter. And as a result of this, the snowfall and lack of gas causing some of their generation to go offline, there was not enough generation to meet this demand. So the rolling blackouts we saw were really a mismatch between supply and demand. And in the future, the ways to mitigate these mismatches are increase the amount of generation, whether through additional power plants or local generation, as you just heard, or reduce the amount of demand. So that's what I'm going to be focusing on, how we can reduce demand through energy efficiency program. So next slide, please. So this, a study out of NREL has looked at the potential for energy efficiency. This is focused primarily on single family housing, but was probably similar in other sectors, multifamily housing or commercial industrial. So in Texas, there's a lot of opportunity to reduce, to cost effectively reduce demand in single family houses. So this NREL study found about the 30% reduction in single family household energy usage is possible through cost effective means. And if you focus on measures that are incredibly cost effective with a payback period of less than 5%, there's still over 20% reduction available. So a 20% reduction in our peak demand on Valentine's Day likely would have avoided those rolling blackouts we saw. So Texas historically has, for the past 10 years or so, has really underinvested in energy efficiency. Often we look at sort of savings as a percent of retail sales. They've been averaging, in 2019, they saw about 0.2% savings in, as a percent of retail sales as a result of utility funded energy efficiency programs in Texas. This is sort of an order of magnitude less than what we're seeing in leading jurisdictions where savings as a percent of sales are over 2%. Next slide, please. Ooh, this slide didn't come up at all. So there's lots of opportunities to save money through energy efficiency. Again, this was showing a cost curve for some single family home opportunities, but there's opportunities like lighting. In Texas specifically, a lot of electric heat and hot water, and significant opportunities through the use of highly efficient heat pumps for both heating and hot water to save a large amount of energy cost effectively. Similar opportunities exist in commercial and industrial processes, lots of lighting and HVAC opportunities. So there's a suite of energy efficiency programs that save customers money and will pay back fairly quickly. Next slide, please. In addition to the grid benefits from energy efficiency that I'm talking about and the customer benefits of reduced energy bills, there's a whole host of other benefits that come from energy efficiency. So folks that install energy efficiency measures see benefits in terms of increased comfort and improved air quality and health in their homes and businesses. It's been shown to increase employee productivity. So a comfortable, efficient office is a much nicer place to work. That is, I think I'm shivering in my cold basement these days working, and I can say I am more productive when I'm back at the office. In addition, there's lots of benefits to society. Significant local jobs are created through implementation of energy efficiency, as well as improved air quality and reduced water usage. Next slide, please. I wonder what happened. So in addition to energy efficiency, there's opportunities through what we call demand flexibility or demand response. So energy efficiency reduces energy usage at all times, including under times of grid stress, and this can help alleviate stress on the grid by just having less demand to serve. But in addition, through demand response, you can move demand from one time to another, either by incentivizing customers to reduce their load or shift load from one time to another. And these programs have been run successfully for many years in lots of jurisdictions. Next slide, please. So I was going to provide a brief example. This isn't from California, from Texas. This is an example from California last summer. So there was an unprecedented heat wave in California last August, which led to rolling blackouts there on August 14th and 15th. They were much smaller than what we saw in Texas. They were, less than 100 megawatts short, whereas we were thousands of megawatts short in Texas these last few days. But still sort of unusual weather driving unprecedented demand for electricity and the lack of generation to meet that demand. So on August 18th, which is when this slide is from, they were expecting a similar issue. The sort of high dotted black line was the day ahead forecast for electricity, what they were expecting the day before in terms of their load, over 50,000 megawatts on their system, which would have been a new record for summer load in California. But during that day, the essentially California's utilities called on all of their demand response programs, as well as asking customers voluntarily to reduce energy usage. So what we see is the actual load was almost 10% lower than what they'd projected the day before. And as a result, they were able to avoid rolling blackouts on the 18th, which they hadn't been able to do on previous days. So by calling on these customer-focused programs, they've got a whole suite of programs run by the utilities, through smart thermostats to reduce cooling need, while also working with large customers and that can interrupt their load either through on-site generation, storage, or just by curtailing operations. They were able to make a significant dent in reducing their load and avoiding blackouts. And similar programs are run by ERCOT in Texas, but they don't have the utility run programs that they do in California, which is what was used on the 18th to reduce demand. So I believe that is my last slide, and I will pass it back to Johanna.
Thanks so much, Justin. And I'm sorry that some of your figures got lost in translation.
No problem.
Our next speaker is Carl Robigo. He is the principal at Robigo Energy LLC, also a former commissioner of the Texas Public Utilities Commission. Carl has over 30 years experience in energy and climate policy and markets, including as the former executive director of the Pace Energy and Climate Center at the Pace University School of Law in White Plains, New York. Carl is widely recognized as an innovator in electric utility regulatory issues relating to clean energy services and technologies. We're thrilled to have you with us. Go ahead, Carl.
Thank you so much, Johanna. It's great to be with old friends and new friends talking about this really important work ahead. And I don't have any slides, so hopefully that will allow me to be faster than I normally would. I don't have to read every word I put on my slides, a problem I sometimes have. I'm going to talk to you in two specific areas today from the solution sets. And everything I say should be seen as building on the opportunities that have already been laid out for you by the folks that have come ahead of me, and then we'll also be sort of wrapped up by when PJ starts talking about his experience in Puerto Rico and what can be done there. But the two topics for me are, number one, microgrids, and I'll explain what that is, and imports, the idea of ending this isolationist policy that the Texas electric grid practices through its ERCOT system. So first with microgrids, I want to make sure everybody's on a common understanding of what it is. A microgrid is a subsection of the electric grid that can be isolated from the rest of the grid and continue to operate. The idea is that the term that we use is islandable, which is why PJ's experience is going to be so relevant and valuable. A microgrid can keep operating even if the entire grid is down, or even if neighboring parts of the grid have to be going through some kind of load shedding or load reduction event. So a microgrid, as you start thinking about it, it can be a point of refuge. It can be a place where you maintain electricity by taking advantage of a suite of technology options. Energy storage, first and foremost, local generation. Great to fill that energy storage up with sunlight that you accumulate, but it could also be used to accumulate thermal energy, which can be stored, especially, for example, in the summertime. Making ice at night is a good way to get energy during the day for air conditioning. It includes sophisticated energy management techniques and tools. It also includes the ability to compartmentalize your load so that some plugs may not work, but the ones you really need are 100% always on. So the microgrid can be as simple as a customer. If you think about it, there could be a microgrid of one, a customer with their own emergency backup through storage and or generation can be their own microgrid. But typically utilities, the configuration, the relationship with the utilities, they cannot keep running when the grid goes down. And I want to stress, there's an important safety reason why we care about this. When line workers from utilities come back into the system or work in the system to make sure the grid is up and running, if they have to replace a line that got pulled down because of ice or a transformer that failed, they sure as heck can't have electricity coming back at them from the customer side. So typically speaking, we shut off everything a customer's doing when the grid goes down. Everything else follows suit. Microgrids have special technology that enables them to run safely, but not threaten the safety of linemen, workers from the utility, or the electrical integrity of the grid. So that's an important distinction. It costs a little bit more, but here's a really good thing. When you put in microgrid technology, you actually make your load work better. You're managing your electric consumption better. And it's actually valuable to have a microgrid in place, even if it's still interconnected, connected to the rest of the grid, because it becomes a place of better usage. It's a premium location. Typically, efficiency makes them very, very valuable loads for the utility to have. So a microgrid can provide lots of benefits. In addition, it can also, I think I mentioned this before, I want to emphasize, a good microgrid, say in a neighborhood size or a city block or a couple of city blocks size, can actually end up being a valuable point of refuge. So that people who get curtailed for other reasons, who lose their electricity or heat or other services, can actually come to the microgrid and get essential services. We found this experience with hurricanes in a lot of places. So you can get shelter in place through a microgrid as well, especially if you build it around critical urban or even rural infrastructure. I want to just hit on two additional points real quick about microgrids and things that came up. Austin experienced the problem, and I used to work at Austin Energy, so I know that the downtown grid in Austin is what is called a network. It's a highly interconnected part of the geography that absolutely could not be curtailed. Downtown Austin kept its electricity going because of the technical electric configuration of the grid. And what that meant was that the city of Austin had fewer options. If that same downtown network could be configured into a microgrid, it could keep operating but not represent a load that had to be served. In effect, it could act like one of those demand response resources that Justin just described by switching to its own power from the broader grid power. It could actually ease the strain on the grid and allow other customers to keep being served. Second, one of the things we learned in 2011 was that because ERCOT cannot go down, I mean, it becomes the prime directive in the Texas grid. And it's because, as Bill Magnus, the CEO, testified, it could be weeks or months to get the entire grid up if the ERCOT grid fails. Talk about putting all your eggs in a basket, whole nother discussion. But because of that, in a place like Austin, about 1/3 of all the circuits have to be protected no matter what because they're ERCOT circuits. Another third of the circuits that keep getting protected are those that are associated with hospitals or critical healthcare facilities. That makes good sense, but because those facilities are not configured to run kind of like a microgrid, you can't take advantage of the fact that they also usually have emergency generating equipment. We just don't touch those circuits when, if we had smarter technology like the stuff used in microgrids, we might be able to turn them on and off and still provide the 100% guarantee of power and heat that is necessary in those facilities. So there's more to be done. And by the way, that when you take those 2/3, 1/3 for ERCOT, 1/3 for healthcare and critical safety infrastructure, the reason why people suffer so much is because the city managing the utility really has fewer than 1/3 of all its circuits in which to absorb the load reduction that ERCOT tells them they have to make. So they've tied their hands instead of increasing their flexibility. The second thing I'm going to talk about, and again, very briefly, because I know I'm going over a little bit here, but I'm at risk of getting off the schedule, is imports. One of the ideas is, hey, ERCOT's not connected to the rest of the United States or not adequately connected. Can we take advantage of electricity from other places? And the answer is possibly yes. But due to climate change, our weather events are getting more regional. So it's possible that when we want it, they may want it too. Arkansas had snow and ice, as did other neighboring states. We don't have to do a full-on interconnection. You can use targeted ties. When I was a commissioner, we had 9 ties into Mexico for economic opportunity sales from between Laredo and the Nuevo Laredo, places like that where you could open it up or close it depending on what was the opportunity. So we need to explore more of that. It is important to know that large-scale renewable energy performed pretty much as expected, as somebody else pointed out. That means that large-scale renewables in other states is also going to be performing pretty much as expected. And given the rapidly falling costs of renewables, one of my favorite topics, we should be thinking about building more so that it's available to us not only here, but in the rest of the region. I'll close up by making 3 quick points. And one I've already mentioned. This allegiance to the ERCOT monster machine really constrains local options. And if there's anything they have a conversation about in Austin and in the rest of Texas, it should be how to empower local communities to see that their needs are best met. One of the things that happened with the ERCOT creation and the nodal market, as they call it, is that a lot of local utility control over the grid had to be surrendered to the big machine. That machine has a bias to consumption. Those things we talked about, like energy efficiency and demand response, are actually an economic challenge to the big game of selling lots of electricity. And there's an easy fix for all this. Let's do some more cost benefit analysis to evaluate all these trade-offs. I happen to know the local, efficient, clean energy solutions will win. I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Carl. Our final speaker is PJ Wilson and his colleague. PJ is the founder and president of the Solar and Energy Storage Association of Puerto Rico, or CISA. And CISA is the trade association that represents companies who are dedicated to transforming Puerto Rico's electric sector into a new solar and storage-based paradigm. PJ relocated to Puerto Rico in 2017 after Hurricane Maria devastated the island. And he brought with him his 12 years of experience developing the renewable energy and energy efficiency sectors in his home state of Missouri. So thank you, PJ. We're excited to have you wrap us up.
Great, thank you. It's great to be here. I think I'll start off with a phrase that probably everyone's heard before, but never let a good crisis go to waste. That's what happened in Puerto Rico in 2017 with Hurricane Maria, when it wiped out the power grid for the whole island for 9 months, longer for some people. And that's when I moved here to help out. I don't have any slides today. I have something better, and introduce you to my colleague, Javier Rua.
I'm a living slide. I'm Javier. I'm from Puerto Rico. I'm a former public servant in environmental protection, but also in telecoms regulation. Those two get married and you have energy regulation. So, you know, and I suffered the longest blackout in US history in Puerto Rico. And now I'm a solar and storage microgrid of one in my family. So we one of the things that I say, and these presentations have really emphasized it, there's some things that really unite, and this is counterintuitive, unite Puerto Rico and Texas in the narrative. You know, we are both islanded for different reasons. We're islanded for geographical reasons, Texas for bad political choices. We are highly affected by climate change in different ways. Highly dependent on centralized generation paradigms and fossil fuels. And now we are both united by the knowledge that distributed paradigms are the way to go for the future. So I'll leave it there for now, but that's really our story, and that's what we do. And all hands on deck on CESA.
So thank you, Javier. One thing, I read an article that said Texas was within a matter of minutes of having a catastrophic failure that would have taken months to have the power come back online, which is unimaginable, except for that's exactly what happened in Puerto Rico. It took months for the power to come back online. And I didn't get here until 6 weeks after the hurricane, so I didn't experience the worst of it, but I was still without power my first month and was going around and handing out really small solar and storage kits to people during the blackout. I was thankful that I had just taken a course through Johns Hopkins called Psychological First Aid, because what was happening is this complex PTSD phenomenon that just kept going on and on, because no one knew when the power would come back on, and all the cascading effects that came from that. Then once we kind of emerged from that, an earthquake happened and knocked the power out again, January of last year, and then kind of recovered from that. And then COVID happened. So it's a very resilient culture here in Puerto Rico. But it is just sort of amazing how many disasters.
And just to say, that PTSD aspect, this is not hypothetical. I had a little generator, like a propane generator, and my stomach was aligned to the sounds of the generator. So that it might break down, and I have to like fix it in the middle of the night, and then you become normal again, and then it makes another strange noise, and then you're like in a blackout. So you have to protect your family, keep things going. Things will break down. Things are not working, and the things we do now with solar and storage are like worry less, like without worry.
when we formed, so after 2 months of disaster response work, and this unique intersection actually of, I mean, disaster response has been going on for all the history of time, ever since disasters have been around. But it's only until really recently that the cost of solar has gotten down, solar with storage, that it can actually be a solution that helps in the midst of a disaster. So we noticed that solar companies weren't particularly coordinated with each other. So we put on a conference and brought everyone together, and then formed the local affiliate of SEIA, the National Solar Energy Industries Association. But at our first board meeting, we looked around and realized we had half the board was with storage companies. So we changed our name to the Solar and Energy Storage Association. So one thing that has changed a lot since before Maria, there was around 10,000 homes with solar systems installed, almost zero with batteries. Even though it's the oldest and most unreliable grid in the nation, still batteries are pretty expensive. Since there's now around 25,000 systems installed 3 years later, and almost all of them have batteries. It is the batteries that save lives when the power grid goes down, and it's solar that is the cleanest way and the most reliable way to keep it charged. There was problems with fuel supply after Maria, right?
Yeah, logistical nightmare. You know, we're islanded. We are surrounded by ocean, as Trump said, big ocean, and we couldn't procure fuels. So, you know, it's the fuel froze in Texas. We couldn't get it here. And it was scarce. You had to fuel the hospitals, fuel the, you know, everything else. So it was difficult.
One of the first projects I worked on was a mobile solar trailer for a hospital on the west side of the island. The hospital was without power for a month because they had a generator to power the whole hospital, but it failed. They had a backup generator and it failed, and they had a third backup generator. It also failed. So there was no power in most of the hospitals around the island for months. So I'm hoping that in Texas, something happens that's similar. And in Puerto Rico, it kind of felt like the shock paddles to the system of energy resiliency. It was just obvious every day. There was a big problem with a power situation. So in response to that, the legislature passed 100% renewable energy law. Said, okay, we're going to completely rethink the way that we're doing things here. That was really exciting to be part of that process and to see it succeed, to see the law succeed. And then we rolled up our sleeves, and I learned everything that Carl Rago taught me from my work in Missouri. And we engaged with the regulators. We engaged with the IRP process, the multiple rulemakings that have come. It's not just 100% renewable energy law. It's also a 30% energy efficiency law, demand response, performance incentive mechanisms, just everything in the kitchen sink you can imagine that could help from a policy angle to lower the stress on the grid and increase the renewables on the grid.
Good interconnection, net metering, all the policies, virtual power plants even.
In the midst of that traumatic situation, one thing that was really helpful is the Rocky Mountain Institute had their top staff came in and helped bring together all the policy-oriented people, which included the two senators that became the co-authors of this 100% renewable energy law, one of whom is now the Secretary of State and Lieutenant Governor of Puerto Rico. So we are just really excited about the federal leadership now that is going to actually release all the promised federal funds that have not come to Puerto Rico, and the local leadership's ability to sort of catch that money and then design it well and get it deployed to be a really decentralized solar and storage based system. This week, the utility company released a 1,000 megawatt RFP. Then where they were ordered to have it be top priority to be the virtual power plant model. So 1,000 megawatts is about the size of a nuclear power plant. So it could be one power plant, or it could be 200,000 houses with storage systems distributed around the island. That's all utility interactive. And when the grid does fail, those 200,000 houses have power. So that's what we're really cheering on and looking for leadership in other areas from other utilities and regulators to see what's worked well there. We're forming additional organizations as well. We have a 501c3 nonprofit that's currently seeking funding. We have the local chapter of Puerto Rico Interfaith Power and Light that we're taking steps to deliver, or to give birth to. That was something that happened naturally after the hurricane during the blackout, is that churches that normally would never have talked to each other between faiths, they were collaborating on how to get supplies out because they were more organized than the government itself. It was
the best of humanity comes out in crisis. You know, it really does. Solidarity and cooperation, collaboration, and good faith.
So we're hoping for a transformation similar to that in Texas. And if we can be of any assistance with what we have learned and are still learning here in Puerto Rico, then we're happy to help.
That is wonderful. Thank you so much for sharing your experiences. We are going to get into the Q&A portion of the webinar. And one question that's come up is, kind of building off of the story that you just talked about in Puerto Rico, which is, what does legislative action look like and what's coming down the pike, both in Texas and nationally? So I thought maybe Luke and Virginia could start with the Texas piece.
Sure, I can start. Yeah, so we're pushing a lot of the same ideas that all the panelists talked about. So looking at doubling the state's energy efficiency requirement for utilities and more demand response, doing a bill to promote solar and storage, and particularly on schools and fire stations, other critical infrastructure. Looking at more transmission to bring power in both from within the state. There were parts of during the blackout when we had surplus power, we couldn't get it to customers because of lack of transmission, as well as what Carl was talking about, connecting the grid, with the rest of the country. So yeah, those are some on the electric side. Virginia, do you want to talk about what you're pushing?
Yeah, I mean, I'm looking specifically at the Railroad Commission, but I think overall we're going to see some restructuring of ERCOT, of the Public Utilities Commission of Texas. And I think it's important that the Railroad Commission is included in that. I think one of the worst ideas that came out of today's testimony was the suggestion that ERCOT and PUC report to the Railroad Commission. I don't think that's a great idea because we haven't seen a lot of good attention to detail or proactive planning coming from the Railroad Commission. And so that would be a backward step. I think that, as I mentioned before, a lot of us are talking about winterization of gas wellheads, but I think we need to see the analysis come in and we need to respond to the investigation that comes through on this. In 2011, there were very thorough studies done and we just didn't respond, and we can't see that happen again.
Thank you so much. And then I will say at the national level, Environment America is supporting both the extension of clean energy tax credits to the end of the decade, as well as the expansion of those tax credits so that things like solar storage systems and electric vehicle, infrastructure can be part of, something that the government actually supports in advancing and helping people make that transition. All right, we've got another couple of questions. So one is, the crisis in Texas, was not something anybody planned for, but should people and regulators expect these kinds of extremes to be the new normal? So it's kind of a question related to climate change. Is there somebody here who's interested? Carl, do you want to take that one?
I'll say yes, we should. I mean, they're going to happen more often, and they're going to be more severe. We know that from scientific and weather modeling analysis for, 20 or 30 or more years. One of the things that's good about it is that climate has become so important that we are getting better weather models being produced, and there are people like Vibrant Clean Energy, a firm located here in Boulder that is, or I live in Denver, but nearby in Boulder, to me, that is working on trying to match the power of weather models with electric grid models. And I think we have to push on our regulators and our legislators to adequately fund agencies to do that work. One of the side issues that showed up in this whole ERCOT debacle and in the past is that the tax cutting fever of Texas over the past 20 plus years has left some of our critical government agencies without the skills necessary to do a good job of predicting, much less reacting and planning for this kind of increased weather.
Thank you. All right, I think we have time for one more question, which is, given that these extreme weather events are upon us and happening now, what's the first thing we should do?
I can chime in for that. Yeah, if efficiency first, reduce the stress on the grid itself so that you don't have as many blackouts, and then individual homes, hospitals, everything with localized solar and storage so it's able to operate during, plan for blackouts to happen. That's what we have to do in Puerto Rico. We know, we just got an alert. Apparently the National Weather Association is considering making the official start date of hurricane season May 15th instead of June 1st this year. We saw that and our hearts were just like, oh my, 2 weeks less to prepare. We are going to have blackouts no matter what. So
Yeah, there was a NOAA notice. NOAA just came out with that. So imagine that, a whole year almost of hurricane season.
Okay, so I'm hearing efficiency first.
Yeah, and I guess to follow up on that, appreciate folks pointing that out. That's what we advocate for. And there was a study by the American Council for an Energy Efficient Economy a few years ago looking at what are the best policies to support energy efficiency, and some sort of energy efficiency resource standard has been shown to sort of lead to the greatest savings in a state. There are other ways to support energy efficiency in terms of utility business models and providing an opportunity to for the utilities to earn a profit on energy efficiency investments similar to other investments in the grid. But a resource standard, which Texas was the first state to pass an energy efficiency resource standard, but it is well out of date and has been weakened a number of times since it was originally passed.
All right, we're at time. We've seen some good questions come through about what obstacles do communities face when looking to adopt microgrids and how they can overcome those barriers. But I know we are at time. Maybe people can engage with our panelists on Twitter and answer some of those questions. It will certainly be a continuing conversation. So thank you all very, very much for joining us today. Thank you for your work and have a great weekend. Bye-bye.